back to the Radio Ancapistan podcast, episode 3, brought to you by Razor Blade Mattresses. If you want an excruciating sleep, try Razor Blade Mattresses. I am here with my co-host, Wes Savage, and a special guest star. You may know him from the Mises Institute and his work, The Case Against Intellectual Property. May I introduce Stephan Kinsella.
Hey, I'm Stephan Kinsella. I'm an attorney in Houston, Texas, and I am a longtime Austrian sympathetic and libertarian anarchist and writer.
Thank you for coming on the show. So where did you study?
Well, I went to Louisiana State University, LSU, for undergrad and master's in electrical engineering, and then I went to law school there, and then I went to the University of London for a master's in international law, and now then I started practicing patent law after a brief stint doing oil and gas law. So I'm a patent attorney.
So how did you become a libertarian?
Well, I was in high school in the early 80s in Louisiana, and a private Catholic high school in Baton Rouge, and a librarian who knew I liked to read and liked weird things like philosophy and that stuff recommended Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead to me. So I read that, and then it took off from there. So I was kind of a Randian for a few years, but and a minarchist. But increasingly, when I came across the other libertarian writing of like Rothbard and David Friedman and the Tannehills and other anarchists, I became more of a radical anarchist libertarian and increasingly an Austrian.
That's very interesting, because that's how I kind of started out. I began listening to some of Rand's kind of lectures. Then I went into just kind of Hayek and other realms, and I just kind of listened to Mises and Rothbard lectures, and I started out very similar. I started this channel 6 years ago.
Nice.
Podcast I've been doing recently, but I relate to kind of your story, because that's kind of how I started out. And how I started out as well was I would argue with my teachers, like my history teachers, about different history, and I believe one of them was more Keynesian leaning, so it was very interesting discussions.
All right. Dankeschön. Well, as I was born here in Louisiana, near the Natchitoches in the Parish area. About 1996, I moved to Missouri in the area known as Bloomsdale. I grew up there and went to school in St. Genevieve. And I grew up there and for 8 years, moved back in 2004 after a boulder landed on my father from the top of High Wall. He lived 7 more years, lost him in 2011. It happens. And by around now, try not to cringe, please. It's pretty bad when I say this, but I kind of got to where I was somewhere between some of the leanings like George Carlin and Noam Chomsky by it. But what I guess you could say black pilled me was I was also a Bernie fan. Mm-hmm. Then I saw Noam Chomsky support, instead of Bernie, he supported Clinton and certain others, and I'm thinking there's a big problem here. And and I saw with the DNC shenanigans, and I said, So I started going back to Ron Paul, and I listened to Ron Paul, and then the first two guys that I learned economics through were Walter E. Williams and Thomas Sowell. And then I started going into Hayek, because I learned of Hayek as well as Mises through Williams. And then I started in more like I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, I started listening to Mises more and Rothbard and so on. And then I eventually found Hoppe on my own, but I started reading in certain article pieces he wrote. And then some people messaged me some books because they were also interested in Hoppe, and someone who's no longer doing political content on the internet, sadly. Hoploo was one of them, and he was one of the Mr. Hoploo. He used to do anarcho-capitalist content, and he started vanilla, but he became more of a Hoppe follower, and he's one of the people that introduced me to
Who's
more
that?
of Hoppe's works. And he was one of the catalysts in that. And then around the same time, that's when I found your piece, when I really appreciate it, because I got a piece of paper that was my would-be patent application, but I gave that up because I realized how contradictory and, IP was, but through your work, and I appreciate that, because that would have been wasted $5,000 for me. So we're trying to do that. And so yeah. So thank you for that very much.
So you've done a lot of work with
And that's how
intellectual property,
I came to where I am
writing,
now.
and how'd you get interested in intellectual property?
Well, I was interested in it ever since I read Ayn Rand's arguments about it in, I guess, high school and then college. And, a lot of her writing made sense to me at the time as a minarchist. I changed my mind on some of her views later. I changed my mind on her views on anarchy, of course, and also libertarianism. She condemned libertarianism. So at first I assumed she was correct in her criticism of it because she seemed to be right on other things. But then the more I looked into it, I realized libertarianism was almost identical to the political wing of her philosophy, what she called capitalism. But her argument for IP never made sense because it wasn't really a principled argument like the rest of her arguments about property rights and free market and individual rights, because it had a time limit, and her argument was kind of seemed to be make weight, like she was just trying to justify a legislated law after the fact. So I just puzzled over that and put it on the back burner, just something that never quite made sense to me. In law school, I thought about it a little bit more, but when I started practicing law in 1992, I was doing oil and gas law, and then I decided to switch into patent law. And so I started reading more about libertarian and free market views, pro and con, on intellectual property because I wanted to figure it out because I was practicing it. So around the time I passed the patent bar in 1994, it was right around the time I had done tons of research. And I was trying to find a good argument for IP because everything was dissatisfactory. And I thought, well, I'll come up with one myself because I know Austrian theory, I know libertarian theory, and I know intellectual property law since I'm now practicing it. So I thought I'll be the one who I can put intellectual property on a firm footing. But I couldn't do it either. And I figured out finally why, because I was trying to prove the impossible. And I finally came to the view that it's totally unjustified. And I wrote about it, but I was writing about other things too that interested me more, rights theory itself and contract theory and property theory and legal aspects of all these things, causation. So I just wrote about intellectual property along the way because not many people understand it, and I thought I could contribute something to it, and I did, and it became popular, and so people keep coming back to that issue because I'm one of the few people who knows libertarian theory from a radical sense and Austrianism and intellectual property, and is anti-IP, not pro-IP. So I'm sort of unique in that way. So people keep coming back to me on that, but it's only one of my many interests, although it's the one I'm probably most well known for in many circles.
Yeah, the thing I never really got about intellectual property is it's kind of a pun on itself. The idea that you can own an idea, where that to me, it never really made a lot of sense, because if somebody comes up with a product and somebody comes up with an improvement on that product, then from my understanding, they would need some sort of licensing from the other person to implement that improvement, if I'm wrong.
Correct. Yeah, and if intellectual property lasted forever, like other property rights potentially can, it would mean the strangling of the human race, because you would need permission to do anything at this point. Like, given this, this point in our in our societal development, you'd have to get so many permissions from from descendants of or originators of ideas we all use, like using clothing and fire to cook food and, the wheel, everything, medicine, we would just die out as a species. So the fact that you put a time limit in it to keep it from strangling us is sort of like when you have a minimum wage that only hampers the economy a small amount if it's a small minimum wage, like $7 or $9. But if you made it $1,000 an hour, the economy would collapse, because it would just be unworkable. So when you ask these socialists and these welfare statists, well, if you're in favor of a $15 minimum wage, why not 30? Why not 100? And they just say, well, that's extreme. It's like, well, it's not that it's extreme. It shows the principle behind your policy is harmful. It's just that you're willing to tolerate a little bit of harm, but not society-wide devastation. So intellectual property is the same thing. You put it right. The fundamental problem, a lot of people who get the rough criticism of IP, they word the case wrong. They'll say something like, Kinsella believes that intellectual property doesn't exist, or they'll say that ideas aren't property, and that is actually not quite technically correct. That is not my argument or my view. Rather, the view is that ideas can't be owned. Like it's not that laws that let you own ideas are unjust or bad laws. They literally are not that kind of law. Like it's literally impossible to own ideas, because ownership is always a legal. It's a legal institution where force, either by the holder of the right or some agency that represents him and defends him, physical force can be used against the property of other people or against those people to prevent them from violating your right. So all, as Ayn Rand emphasized, all rights are individual rights. Okay, so we're individuals like Mises was, like there's methodological individualism built into Austrian economics. So the relevant actor in society, in human society, for purposes of any analysis, for moral analysis, for political analysis, for economic analysis, is the individual, because the individual is the one that has values and goals and rights, and the one that acts. So all rights are individual rights, and as Rothbard emphasized, all rights are property rights, and the reason is because rights have to be enforceable, and force is a physical thing, and force can only be applied against the scarce, tangible, material things in the world that we deal with as human actors, which is our bodies, which are physical, scarce things. Like you can physically hurt someone with force, you can punch them or stab them or shoot them, or kidnap them or whatever. And the resources that we grapple and own and use and control, the tools that we use to get things done in the world, what Mises calls a scarce means of action. So all laws always determine an owner of a resource. So all laws have to do with the property right. And property rights can only be applied to things that can be owned, which are scarce resources of action. Ideas simply cannot be owned because they are just the knowledge that we have in our minds that we use to guide what we choose to do. So all human action, and this is Mises and praxeology, all human action is the attempt to achieve an end in the future or a goal by manipulating the causal laws in the world through the use of actions, moving our body in certain ways and grappling and using certain means or tools to get that done, things that can interfere with causally with the world and change the course of events. But those actions are also guided by knowledge, because you couldn't act if you didn't have any understanding of the world. You have to understand your situation, the facts of the world, the way the world is arranged. You have to understand something about what's possible to choose a goal, to choose an end. So you have to envision different possibilities in the future that you prefer over what's coming if you don't intervene. And you have to have some knowledge about the possible means that can causally achieve that. That means you have to have some knowledge of laws of cause and effect, and technological information. It's all part of that, like how you can arrange things to make tools more efficient to get things done. It could be a simple fishing pole or a net or or a hut or clothing or fire, or it could be a cyclotron or a space shuttle or, an iPhone or an automobile or, a nuclear power plant, something like that. So if you take, for example, the classic intellectual property laws, which would be copyright and patent, the others are trademark and trade secret and some other more minor laws, but let's just focus on patent and copyright, the two big ones. Those laws are said to give propriety in ideas, but they really don't. What they really do is they reassign ownership rights in scarce resources, because that's all a law can ever do. So, for example, if I hold the copyright over a novel and I sue you in state court for infringing my copyright, what I'm asking for is for the court to use the power of force that it has because of the state monopoly on violence to force the defendant to do something, like to pay me money or to stop publishing a book with his own printing press. So it's basically, I'm asking for ownership of his money, which is a scarce resource in a free market anyway, or it's to claim a partial ownership right in his printing press and his body by issuing a coercive command telling him he can't use that property in a certain way. In the law, that's called a negative servitude or a negative easement. So the IP law really grants me a negative property right, a negative easement, which is a type of property right in your resources that you own, your physical resources, not your ideas. The idea is the idea that you have a right to profit off of your ideas is the excuse or the justification given for this law, but the law itself is a reassignment of property rights and scarce resources. Same thing with patents for inventions. So it's similar to how people say that people have different views about religion and they take it really seriously, and they have wars fought over religion. I mean, that's a sloppy way of putting it. It's not actually technically correct. What they really mean is that when you have a conflict or a fight or a dispute over religion, religion is the motivating factor. In other words, a disagreement over religion is the motivation for why you commit aggression. So if if religion A, people of that go to war against tribe B because they think they're heathens or they have the wrong religion or they want to convert them or something, they have to use physical force against those other people's bodies or their property. They take their cows, they take their women, they take their land, they kill the men. So it's all the conflict is always about physical things, just like property rights are always about physical things. So when people say people fight over religion, what they really mean is that they're identifying the motive for the crime, but the crime is a crime of violence. Just like people confuse intent with motive in law because they're sloppy with their terminology, which is fine in a casual, informal day-to-day basis. But if you want to think technically about it, if I shoot someone because I hate them, you can call it a hate crime if you want, but the crime is shooting them, is using their body without their permission, like invading the borders of their body with a bullet, right? Or with my hand or with a knife or something like that. The reason I did it was, if you think of praxeology, the end I had in mind was to hurt someone that I despise, let's say, or it might be to coerce them into giving me their money if I'm robbing them. So there could be any number of reasons why I hurt them. So that's the end or the purpose. And in the law, we would, as in libertarian law, in my belief, if you go to punish someone for a crime they committed, you have to first determine that it was an intentional act. Intentional means that you did it on purpose. Okay, it means you did the harm on purpose. You invaded their body on purpose. But the motivation is your end goal, your reason for doing it. You can take the reason into account in determining the severity of the punishment, which is why first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter all have different punishments because the motivations are different. But the action itself is the same because you intentionally violated the borders of someone's body. So they're both equally intentional, but the purposes are different. So likewise, when you have a war fought over religion, the religious difference is the reason that you harm someone. So if you take it back to intellectual property, the false belief that you have that there's unfairness if people compete with you by copying what information you publicly release into the world. So if you publish a novel or paint a painting and you publicly sell it or show it, you're revealing to the world information that was before that private to your mind. So you chose to make it public for your own reasons, like because you wanted to make a profit, or you wanted to show off, or you wanted to let people know you're a brilliant artist. Or if you sell a new mousetrap you invented with a new feature, you chose to reveal your inventive innovation by selling the mousetrap that has that feature publicly discernible from the people that buy it, right? And your competitors. So you chose to make the information public for your own reasons. And because people falsely believe that that's so unfair, and I think they think it's unfair because of a confusion in law, justice, and property rights, sparked in part by the original way that John Locke justified individual rights and property rights with this labor theory of property. The idea that the reason you have the right to own an unowned resource in the world that you start using, you become the first user of, is because you own your body because God gave it to you, and therefore you own your labor, which is that's the mistake in my view. You don't own your labor just because you own your body, and therefore if you own your labor, it's like a substance that you exude or that you emit, and if you throw it into the world by mixing it with some unowned resource, you have to own the resource you intertwine your labor with. Otherwise, you would lose the ownership of your labor. So you have to own the thing you mix it with. So Locke has this kind of circuitous, unnecessarily roundabout argument for arguing that the first person to transform a resource that's unowned gets to own it. I think you can just say the reason that someone owns a resource he transforms is because he's the first. And he's proven that with an objective link, like by putting up a border around it or transforming it in a visible, publicly visible way. You don't need to say that you own your labor to do that. And once you say you own your labor, and that's the reason why you can own these unowned resources, you start thinking of labor as a substance that you own. And then this leads to the labor theory of value of Adam Smith and Ricardo, and then Karl Marx and communism, right? So this idea that employers can or stealing from their employees when they make a profit because they're taking the surplus labor value that the employee put into the product to make the product. So you have all these confusions in political theory, and they're with us today when people say, oh, you ripped off someone when you copied them, or you knocked them off, or you pirated, or you stole someone's idea, when all you did was you copied what you used information that they voluntarily made public by their own actions. So once you so because of that false moral belief that it's unfair, they come up with patent and copyright laws, which are really reassignments of property rights in scarce resources. And once you understand that, then you can see why they're unjust. The injustice of a religious war is not the religious disagreement that motivates the war. It's the actual actions of violence among these people, taking someone's just bodily autonomy or their resources for whatever reason, right? It doesn't matter what the reason is really, except for the extent of punishment. But the fact that it's intentional and you're invading the borders of the resources is the actual crime. And in intellectual property, the actual problem is the restriction of the property rights people have in their bodies and in their owned resources, like their printing presses and their factories that make patented products, for the reason that people think it's unfair for you to copy. But that's just the motivation for these laws. The ultimate problem is the laws themselves.
The one thing I noticed about and I think Nate the Voluntarist said this a long time ago, but I watched his podcast, and you were on it, I believe. And it's kind of like, just because somebody makes a copy of something doesn't mean that the original thing is gone. With stealing, that original thing is gone. But with copying, let's say, a video or a game, there still remains the original item.
Right. Well, property rights arise because we live in a world of scarcity, which means there are certain resources in the world, including our bodies and other things that we employ to get things done, that have a nature that only one person can use them at a time. Like my use excludes your use. And this possibility, living in the world with other people has advantages. You can have relations with other people. We're social beings, so we enjoy that. We have the company of other people. You have the division of labor. You can trade. You can help each other. You can cooperate. So we all have advantages from living among each other. But when there are other people in the mix, you also have the risk that some people might interfere with your use of resources that you have been using to achieve your ends. So you can have conflict. So humans in society, the civilized majority of us, I'd say it's over 90% of normal, non-misanthropic, non-psychotic or sociopathic people want to live in peace and prosperity and trade with each other. So they all agree that it's better if we have a set of property rights that specify who can own a resource. And those rules have to be sort of natural, and they have to be compatible with us living in a world where there's unowned things and we get to use them in the first place. So that means the first person has to have the right to use it, which means the first use has a certain priority of place, which is what Hoppe calls the prior-later distinction. So these property rights emerge because of the fact of scarcity. In the case of knowledge, this knowledge grows over time and everyone can use it at the same time. If I take your bicycle, this is a little video by Nina Paley. It's called a minute meme. It's on YouTube. It's called Copying is Not Theft. And it's, if I take your bicycle, that's a scarce resource and you are using it for transportation. Now you can't use it for transportation. That is why the owner objects to you using it. That's why there's a conflict over that, which property rights would solve. They would say, no, the bicycle is owned by the guy that made it or bought it from a previous owner. But if I see your bicycle and I use my own resources to make a similar bicycle, or even a quote unquote identical bicycle, I've copied your bicycle, but I haven't taken your bicycle from you because my second instance of the bicycle can be used by me. So when you point this out to people that sloppily or dishonestly use words like steal or theft or knock off or rip off, when someone's just copying you, you say, well, obviously I'm not stealing your product because you can still make your product and you still have your idea. You can still use the knowledge that you have. I didn't take your knowledge from you. I mean, Thomas Jefferson gave an example of how using someone's ideas you learn from other people doesn't take anything from them. Just like if you have a lit candle or taper, he calls it, and someone else lights their taper from yours, now you both have a flame lighting your candles. It's not like the second guy took the flame from you. They both have an independently existing flame on their own candles. So it actually expands the amount of light in the world. And similarly, ideas spread, and that's a good thing. That's why the human race is richer now than we were 200 years ago or 5,000 years ago. Not because we're smarter or we have more resources in the world. We're still on the same planet. We still have the same intelligence. We just have more technical knowledge at our disposal about more efficient ways to manipulate the world. So this is a good thing that we have knowledge spread, and the faster it spreads, the richer people can become. I mean, China came out of poverty really quickly compared to where it was 30 years ago because it could start adapting the more advanced scientific methods of the West very quickly. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. They didn't steal anything from us. They were able to rise more quickly, in 30 years instead of the 200 years it took us in the Industrial Revolution. So if you copy someone's information, you don't steal anything from them. Although people say, oh, you stole my idea from me. And if you say, well, you still have your idea, they will stop and they will retort. They will just change their grounds and they will say, well, you stole the profit from me that I could have made. In other words, now they switch from saying, I stole your product, which I didn't because you still have your products, and you stole my idea, which I didn't because you still have access to your knowledge. They'll say, well, you stole my customers, or you stole my future customers, or you stole my future profits that I could have made. It's like, yeah, but you don't have a property right in that. I can only steal something that you own. You don't own your customers. You don't own future profits, because future profits comes from future revenues, which means money that other people own now that they could or could not choose to give to you in exchange for your products that you're selling or services that you're selling in the future. So ultimately saying that I'm stealing profits you could have made is a Marxian or socialist idea that you have a guaranteed right to earn a profit if you labor on something. So it's this labor theory that if you work hard, you earn a return. Now, people are used in the analog world before IP and before technical ideas and things like this became a big part of the economy. People are used to the analog world where everything that you owned was pretty much tangible. And as a rule, by and large, the harder you worked, the more successful you would be, because you work hard to improve the quality of resources that you had at your disposal to transform them into a product. Like, you take metal and rubber and paint or whatever, and you make a car out of it, like a Model T Ford. So you've transformed these input factors into a more valuable configuration, and you can sell it for a profit. So you become rich. And the harder you work, generally, the more money you would earn. So people are used to a relationship between hard work and success. But it doesn't mean that you're entitled to succeed if you work hard. Even in the old world, in the analog days, lots of people worked hard at something and the business venture failed. That's capitalism in the free market. You take a risk, and some ventures work and some don't. It's just like in physics. Work means moving an object through a distance. It doesn't mean pushing on a wall that doesn't move. You can waste your time pushing on a wall all day long and you expend energy and you get tired, but you didn't accomplish anything. You didn't do any work. And likewise, if you spend your effort on a venture that doesn't make a profit because you just don't get enough customers or you don't do it at a profit, then you don't make a profit and your work was wasted. And that's not unjust. And you don't have a property right in earning a return, even though by and large, the harder you work, the more you make. But people have sort of reified that idea. They think that if you work hard and you invest labor in something, again, the labor theory of value, then you're entitled to a return. And the only way you're entitled to a return when you sell it in a product whose chief value is the arrangement of it, like a novel or a painting or a simple invention that others can easily compete with you on by easily copying it. The only way to earn a return is to use the force of law to keep them from competing with you. So if that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do. So they're willing to violate property rights that we already admit exist in scarce resources in order to further this alleged right to earn a return, or as Richard Epstein and other Chicago guys say, to recoup your cost. It's all Marxian in the end, and it's all labor theory of value nonsense. In fact, in copyright law, there's a doctrine called sweat of the brow. Now, that has been eviscerated by the Feist decision, which got rid of copyrights in maps, which used to be copyrightable, under the idea that even though the map is not original, because to get a copyright, you're supposed to have an original work of authorship, something creative, something unique that you came up with. Although one wonders why you can get a copyright on a photograph or a movie, because you're just recording factual data. So the sweat of the brow doctrine said that, well, even though a map is, you go out and you have cartographic surveys and you actually record, the location of roads and geographical features on a map, which is useful. And it is useful, and people would sell those. And then if someone would copy the map, a competitor would copy it, they could be sued for copyright infringement. And then the defense was, well, the map is not original. You didn't come up with the map's features because you're just putting down on paper information that describes the way the earth is arranged. So you can't have a copyright in that. You didn't design the earth, right? And the argument was, well, but you did put labor into creating the map. The sweat of the brow, like you sweat to do it. So therefore there's a copyright. And finally in the Feist decision, I think in the 80s, I forgot when it was, they said, no, you have to have some originality. But still, this argument motivates a lot of people's arguments for copyright and patent. Like if you labor on something, you'll hear this all the time from defenders of IP. They'll say, well, so it's okay if I spend years to write my novel and people can just knock me off or rip me off. It's like, well, so they're assuming that the effort they put into something entitles them to some kind of return. And the fact that it entitles them to use force to stop people from competing with them. Because if people can compete with you, it's not easy to earn a return, not without some creativity, right? So basically, they don't like the fact that business models are hard to come up with for products whose chief value is easy to copy. Well, tough luck. Tough titty, said the kitty, because the milk's no good, I mean, this is the free market. You're not entitled to return. Sometimes it's hard to compete. Sometimes it's easy to compete. And for things that it's easy to compete with you on, you have to either find a way to make a profit despite this competition. That's what the free market is. That's what competition is. Or you have to give up the project. Some projects are not economically viable because you can't make a profit. There's lots of reasons you can't make a profit on a given project. And when you determine that you can't make a profit, you shouldn't do it because it's a misallocation of resources. I mean, as Hans-Hermann Hoppe pointed out to me in conversation recently after I had my debate with Richard Epstein at the Soho Forum in November in New York, just a couple months ago, you have all these IP guys saying that, well, there's all these creative works like novels and song music and things that wouldn't be created if you don't give them a legal monopoly on their movie or their novel or their whatever. And there are some inventions that you wouldn't come up with, some pharmaceuticals that you wouldn't come up with if you couldn't stop competition. Yeah, well, the Austrian view is, well, that means that you're overstimulating innovation that shouldn't happen because, the resources that go into coming up with a product that you can sell on the market, that's only profitable if you have a legal monopoly that stops competition, means that those resources don't go to some other project that you could have done. So it's the classic case of the boom bust cycle that Mises talks about in the Austrian business cycle theory, where you have artificial stimulation of certain projects by when you lower the interest rates, for example, you make certain projects more viable that wouldn't be viable in a normal free market. And so you have misallocation of resources, and that leads to a collapse later on. That's basically inefficient use of resources, which impoverishes us all on average. Same thing with this. When you have a monopoly law of the government like patent or copyright, which artificially stimulates the production of music and novels and books and inventions that wouldn't be economically viable without that, that's a misallocation of resources. I mean, maybe we'd be better off with, instead of 10 million novels a year, with only 7 million that are the good ones, not the crap. We have a lot of crap coming out, and we have a lot of innovations that are waste in the sense of you have people coming up, so you'll have people defend patents. I say, like, well, I can't make a printer cartridge that's compatible with a Xerox. So Brother has to come up with their own design and say, well, that's good. It stimulates them to come up with another way of doing it. Yeah, but that's inefficient. I mean, imagine if everyone had to have a different size road, like you have 17 types of road widths or train track widths in the world. Sometimes uniformity makes sense. Compatibility makes sense. Interoperability makes sense sometimes. And if you artificially make someone do a workaround that's less efficient than the one they would want to do, but that they're prevented to do by the patent, you're reducing efficiency and thus reducing the wealth of society as a whole.
And that also just enables more fuckery, basically, as well.
Yep.
I had a would-be patent application, but after I read your book and after you rehashed these, and you just reminded me of why I just said fuck it essentially when I gave that pursuit up, because
Well, I will say I don't think that it's completely unjust to get a patent in today's world. Sometimes this because we have a patent system, sometimes some companies need to get patents for defensive reasons, if nothing else, or to get funding from a VC who's going to ask you, do you have the patents that you could get? And if you don't do it, they're going to move on to the next guy, because patents can give you a competitive advantage in the market, both to stop competition and also to defend yourself from patent infringement lawsuits. So unfortunately, sometimes it's necessary. I think people get them more often than they need to, and they think they're a good thing. I've got a pamphlet on this. It's called "Do Business Without IP," where if you want to try to minimize your use of resorting to the IP system like copyright and patent, here's how you can do it in creative ways. But I don't blame some companies for doing it. I view, and I help companies do it still to this day. I don't help companies assert them in an aggressive or offensive way against innocent companies. But I would have no qualms in helping one of my clients assert one of their patents in a countersuit against someone who's suing them for patent infringement. So it's an unfortunate waste. I view it as helping companies buy like ammunition or weapons or bullets. Like you're a gun manufacturer and you're selling guns. People need guns. Unfortunately, they need guns for self-defense because there's crime in the world. If we lived in a world of no crime, we would have far fewer guns. You wouldn't have to waste money buying guns all the time, right? Or locks on your doors. There's lots of defensive measures people take because of the existence of bad things like crime and government oppression. Without that,
what I was going to mention was another thing I wanted to mention was sometimes to prevent monopolization control over an idea or a practicable concept, you cannot file a patent and then offer the licensing to use it cheaply. Like this one guy, this permaculture, he's more of a local, like he's a laissez-faire advocate, but he gets certain things like the history of like the idea of, social Darwinism and stuff like that wrong, like the origins of it wrong and what was life. But he's a permaculture entrepreneur and activist. He runs a company called Bloom Distillation. But what he did was he filed a patent on, that's right, I just come back to me, how to use distiller grains to spread over a field to kill weeds through the nitrogen, because of the nitrogen content, because of the protein, when it broke down and released the nitrogen, it would kill the weeds. And you wouldn't have to use all that herbicide, as much herbicide or as much fertilizer. And it would be regenerative to the ground. The patent, he offered it to people. One of the lecturers, he said, hey, if you promise to never use a product again from for farming on from Monsanto, Conagra, Cargill, whatever, you just pay me $1 and along with that promise, and I'll give you the license to get the license patent made for you. And that's to keep it was a demonopolization effort. So that's one interesting thing you can use patent law for as well, I noticed. And he was the only example I could think of that done that. So it's not that common, I don't suppose.
I guess I appreciate the part of the sentiment there. I would oppose. I think that's wrong though, because that's reminiscent of the way copyleft is used for copyright law, which I despise copyleft, and it's called under the Creative Commons called share alike. In software, it's these open source licenses that require you, if you use the software that has a copyright on it, the license requires you to also release your improvements or your derivative works under a share alike or a copyleft. And I prefer just CC0 or CC BY attribution only. Like I prefer the least restrictive. So what this guy is, he got a patent, and he is saying you can use my patented technique or product, but only if you do X, which is don't do business with Monsanto or whatever. I think that's an unjust use of a patent, although it's probably well intentioned. The thing is, with a copyright, you can, or trademark or copyright, you can always just release it public domain. Or trademark, sometimes you have to get a trademark. Copyright's automatic, you have no choice. So once you're given a copyright by the government, which is as soon as you create a work, you can just release it with a Creative Commons license like CC BY or CC0. Trademark, you only get it if you apply for it. Though that's not true. You get a common law trademark just from use. But if you apply for one, sometimes you need to apply for one, because if you don't apply for it, someone else could file a registration on a similar mark and they could stop you from using it in certain markets. So sometimes you need to get a trademark to keep other people from using the trademark system to hurt you. But once you get a trademark, you're supposed to enforce it. Otherwise you might lose it. But you could enforce it with $1. You could say, listen, I'm going to give a license to anyone who asks. You could pay me $1 and then we're good. That would be the most ethical way to use trademark, in my opinion. For patents, they're very expensive. You only get them if you apply. And if you're not going to assert them, which I think asserting a patent, except for defensively, is always unjust, even in the case of your friend, then there's no reason to spend the $10,000 or $20,000 on the attorney to get the patent in the first place. You could say, if I don't file a patent on it, someone else might independently invent this and patent it and stop me from using it. But there's a couple of responses to that. Number one, ever since Obama's America Invents Act in 2009, there's an expanded prior use defense, which means if you've been using your own invention privately or without patenting it for a while, you can keep using it even if someone else later independently invents it and patents it. So that's one thing. And number two, if you want to keep someone else from getting a patent on it, you don't have to file your own patent. You can just publish your idea. So if you publish it, that serves as a prior art bar for anyone else patenting it, even if they're not aware of the publication and they come up with the invention later independently. So there's a cheaper way to keep someone from getting a patent on what you've invented without filing a patent yourself. And I think if you're an ethical person who wants to minimize your unethical use of the patent system, you can do three things. Number one, you can use trade secrets sometimes instead of filing a patent. Number two, you can just publish your invention publicly to keep someone from getting it. Or as a last resort, in some narrow cases, file a patent, but just use it defensively. Like Twitter has done, for example. Twitter gets patents, but they sign an agreement with their inventor employees who come up with these patents where they give a partial license right back to the employee, meaning they have to get the employee's permission if they want to use the patent in an offensive way. So they sort of handcuff themselves so they can only use their patents defensively, which is a totally legitimate way to do it, I believe. But once you do that, you see that your patent portfolio's value goes down because the offensive use of it is taken away. So its value falls, which means you have less of an incentive to waste your scarce resources of your capital to file patents. So you might file only 1/3 as many patents as you normally would if you were going to use them aggressively.
That's pretty cool.
Makes sense.
Thank you for the input on that.
Sure.
Executioner, you have anything to say?
I find that very interesting, just how defensive patents can work. And so you mentioned earlier about Hoppe. How'd you get introduced to Hoppe's work?
Well, I think my progression was, so Rand was my first big influence, and she's still a big influence, but I rejected a lot of her thought in the meantime. In fact, The Fountainhead, which is the one that got me going, I mean, Atlas Shrugged is great, I think. It's quasi-anarchist, actually, even though she wouldn't admit that. But The Fountainhead is, in retrospect, there's almost nothing good about The Fountainhead. I don't know why I liked it, because it's not libertarian. It's a weird, narcissistic character who basically seems to despise his clients and doesn't do their bidding. He's a weird social loner, and he has quasi-sexual issues with Dominique Franken, and also the core plot revolves around intellectual property terrorism because he basically bombs Cortlandt homes because he doesn't like the design because they didn't use his own drawings properly, even though he didn't have a contract with anyone because he did it secretly behind the scenes in a deceptive way with Peter Keating, right? So everything about the Fountainhead, I think, is very problematic as a libertarian. But anyway, soon after, when I discovered Rothbard and anarchism and Austrian economics and radical libertarian thought, I'd say my main influences were Rothbard and a few others like the Tannehills and David Friedman, but really Rothbard and Mises, and then Mises in economics. And then I discovered Hoppe. Hoppe's writing really blew me away because Hoppe built on the shoulders of Rothbard and Mises. And so those three to me are the core thinkers that have influenced me. I came across Hoppe first with his argumentation ethics when I was in law school, the first year of law school in 1988. I was a reader of Liberty magazine, which was one of the key libertarian periodicals of the time. There weren't a lot. There was a Free Market Reader from the Mises.
Liberty magazine.
Liberty magazine. Yeah, it used to be in print. It's online now, but no, I don't think many people read it anymore.
I still do. I'll still dig up them old articles and I'll still fucking read it.
Oh, the old ones are great. I think the new online version is not that well read. And then Reason magazine, which Reason used to be more radical, it's now more glossy and more public policy type stuff. But
sparkling, you could say.
But now there's hundreds of things, right? But back then that was the only thing. So I read Liberty avidly, and there was an issue in 89 or 88 which had a symposium on Hoppe's, I think it was called The Ultimate Justification of the Libertarian of Private Property Rights or something like that. And it was Hoppe's argumentation ethics. And I was blown away by it. So it influenced my thinking, and I started writing some of my own, my libertarian rights theory was one of the first things I wrote in the Reason Papers Journal, which Tibor Machan edited. And then I did a long book review essay in a law review journal on Hoppe's second book in 1994, and I sent copies of my estoppel rights theory, which draws heavily on his argumentation ethics, and in my long book review, my review essay of his book, which was very favorable. I sent it to Hans, and he sent me a nice note back, and the world was smaller then. The libertarian world was smaller. And so I was in Philadelphia.
Right.
I was living in Philly at the time, and I was a young lawyer, and I knew that the Mises Institute was having, some of those guys from there were having a meeting in Crystal City, Virginia, near DC. It was called the John Randolph Society. It was that paleo-libertarian, paleo-conservative thing where the Chronicles crowd, which I did not like, I never did like them very much, Sam Francis, Tom Fleming, those guys, and the paleo libertarians like Rothbard, Hoppe, Rockwell, and then Walter Block and Joe Stromberg and Tom DiLorenzo, none of whom I had ever met. So I went down in 94 to meet Hans, really, and Rothbard, and I did. Rothbard died 2 months later, so I actually got to meet him before he died. Which
what year was that?
That was November of 94 is when I met them, and Rothbard died in January of 95.
Okay, I was right. I wasn't 3 years old yet, but yeah, I was staying.
So Hoppe, when Rothbard died, he was editing two journals, the Review of Austrian Economics and the Journal of Libertarian Studies, like the two primary journals of this kind of coalition of ideas. And so they assigned the editorship of the JLS to Hoppe, and they assigned the editorship of the RAE to Hoppe, Salerno, and I think Herbener. And after a couple of years, I started attending Austrian Scholars Conferences, which was the spring event every year at the Mises Institute. So I would present various libertarian papers because I was starting to be friends with Hoppe then and all these guys, Walter Block and these guys. And so I became closer and closer to Hans, and he eventually asked me to be the book review editor for the JLS. So we worked closely together. He published lots of my articles in the JLS, including my IP stuff.
I'm not gonna lie, the biggest influences to me currently are the same three you mentioned. Rothbard, Mises, and Hoppe, but I will admit, Sam Konkin kind of has influenced my thinking in certain areas, but I disagree with him on a fuck ton, to say the least. Because
Konkin was one of the very first guys who had a glimmering of the correct libertarian view on IP. I give him a lot of credit for that. He has a good article called "Copy Wrongs."
Yes, thank you.
It wasn't completely right, but it was pretty right, and it wasn't comprehensive. I would say in the libertarian movement, basically the first guy to have a radically pretty good approach to IP was Benjamin Tucker in the late 1800s. But it was flawed with all this kind of labor theory of value stuff, and this, not really that so much, but in his case, it was flawed by his kind of lefty hostility to land, which he viewed as a monopoly. So he opposed
Well, you have to remember, he was a Proudhonian. He took influence. Took influence from Max Stirner and Proudhon.
So he was great for his time, but the first modern, really good people on it was basically Konkin and Wendy McElroy. They got the ball rolling. Konkin and McElroy got it going. I think Wendy's really the first modern anti-IP thinker. Konkin was close, but he only did so much, and then Wendy really got it going, influenced by Tucker and Konkin. Go ahead. I was just going to say after them, I would say it was, and then Tom Palmer at the Cato Institute at the time in 1988 and 9 wrote some really good articles in a more academic way really pushing the boundaries of the anti-IP case. And then Roderick Long and I started writing. So it was sort of that line of thinkers on IP. It was Tucker and then Konkin and McElroy and then Palmer and then me and Roderick Long.
See, I was going to say, where would I go find Miss Wendy McElroy's literature? Where would I go find that?
Oh, well, I have my main website is stephankinsella.com, my libertarian stuff. But
okay, I do read it quite often, so I just need to go type it up.
But I have a second website which is focused on IP stuff. It's called c4sif.org, Center for the Study of Innovative Freedom, and it's a libertarian anti-IP set of material. And on my sort of board of advisors, I have Wendy McElroy and others like that. And if you go to c4sif.org/resources, you'll see a list of Wendy McElroy's key contributions listed right there. Well, so Wendy's foundational stuff is on my is on c4sif.org/resources, and she and I are friends, and we've known each other for a long time, and her work was instrumental in my own work, and in turn, she sort of learned from my further development, and I got her to write like an update of one of her classic articles for my journal, which I had a journal for 10 years that sort of filled in for the JLS after it sort of stopped being published for a while. For about 10 years, I had a journal called Libertarian Papers from, I think, 2009 to 2018. And there's an article in there by Wendy where she sort of recapitulates and restates her IP views and adds an introduction, I think.
Sorry, I just heard a rifle shot.
You better duck then. Well, what were your initial thoughts when you first read Hoppe?
Oh, I was blown away by his argumentation ethics. It just made sense to me because, especially Rothbard's commentary on it, like Rothbard really was blown away by it too, and everything Rothbard said got me excited. I just thought it made so much sense because I was fascinated by his approach, and I guess I had a gnawing dissatisfaction with the two primary ways of defending libertarianism up till then was the utilitarian approach, which is deeply flawed. Consequentialist approach is not bad, but not utilitarian. But I preferred the more principled approach of the natural law, like that Ayn Rand advocated. But there was always something that was unsettling about the natural law case, which Hoppe sort of identified in his own writing. So it just makes a lot of sense to me. That may be one of the best, if anyone's interested in it, he's got lots of presentations of it, some longer, more academic, more detailed ones, like chapter 6 or 7, I think it is, in his Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. And also he's got a longer presentation of it around the same time in 1988, I think, there's a Festschrift, which is a collection of essays in honor of Rothbard, published in 2008 after his death. It's called Man, Economy, and I want to say Man, Economy, and Liberty. And Hans has a long chapter in there which details his argumentation ethics. But for the outsider looking to study it, who's just wants to read a shorter presentation, probably that Liberty magazine version is really accessible and really a good place to start.
Where would I be able to find that the longer, deeper dive into argumentation ethics at?
Well, I run Hans's site and I arrange it sort of like, it's called hanshoppe.com, and I arrange it like mine. It's very simple, but got lots of his stuff on there. Pretty much everything on there that he and I can find we can make digital. And so if you go to hanshoppe.com/publications, you'll find it on there. And also one more thing, I have on my website, Stephan Kinsella. If you go to stephankinsella.com/LLW, which stands for Law in the Libertarian World, my forthcoming book collecting my own writings on this, I have a bunch of relevant blog posts collected, and one of them is called something like Argumentation Ethics, a Concise Guide. That's actually on my publications page. go to my stephankinsella.com/publications and look for Argumentation Ethics, a concise guide. If you click on that, I've got lots of links to all of Hoppe's stuff on this, including the longer.
I also see. I have a few places where I pretty much shill your stuff, Konkin's, Hoppe's, and then there was a guy. One of Hoploo's colleagues, Thauma, introduced me to an engineer, scientist, political theorist, and economist, Paul Birch. He disagreed with anarcho-capitalism. He claimed it would devolve into city-states, but outside of that criticism and his ultra-minimal monarchism, quote unquote, that's a rabbit hole I had thought experimented in my own head for months, waking up, go to sleep with many a weekend night. But
I vaguely recall, I haven't heard that guy's name in a long time, but I vaguely recall seeing some stuff by him maybe 15 or plus years ago on maybe antistate.com or those places. And I remember he had this weird photograph where he looked like some mousy guy with a weird cowlick or something, some oddly, he looked like an odd postal worker or something. I mean, I never knew who the guy was, but he always had some odd.
Paul Birch kind of, he gave me the best critique of Georgism I ever read.
Oh, well, that's impressive. That's to his credit.
Yeah, and then he also made a case for bearer share based monies, and that was how I got into learning about him. So I shielded y'all stuff, and as well as his and Konkin's.
What is that? Bearer based money? What is that?
His article is. You know what? If I can, I'll get it. I'll link it to you. How would I get a hold of you?
Oh, you can just email it to me, But what?
Cool, because it was an interesting. It's called Honest Money, and it was it's an archive of the website he used to have running before he died.
Oh, he died. Is he older?
Yeah, he died back in 2002, and I forgot what the exact cause was, but he had a lot of theoretical physics and engineering stuff, and he talked about how terraforming the planet. He made all kind of stuff, and then he didn't.
Maybe I'm thinking of someone else. I thought he was a young guy, so maybe I'm thinking of
someone else. No, I mean he was. Oh, he was not that old when he died. I don't forgot what the cause was, but yeah, he.
But what's this? Was he opposed to like fractional reserve banking or something? But. Or what
he was opposed to he did not like the way the central banking was done, and he wanted to advocate a more honest money, and he advocated bearer share back monies that you can do, crypto backing, all kind of ways of back. And he did a whole presentation on it. He did a critique of Georgism, and he even mentioned a fringe flavor that even when I heard Georgism, where they called themselves Georgists but are practically commies with Georgist leanings here and there, real weird off fringe. It's like he covered all. I'm like, holy shit. And he pretty much did a detailed, I guess you could say, a nuking of them. And that's what got me interested.
Well, Rothbard has a good evisceration of Georgism, but if there's another good one out there, I always like to collect those things. As for the money thing sounds slightly crankish just from hearing what you said, but who knows? I mean, it couldn't have been.
It was interesting to me. I'll throw it by you and see what you think.
It couldn't have been crypto because this was 2002.
No, he backed up with. He talked about encryption and digital stuff. He mentioned it in the paper. I don't remember exact details toward the end, but.
What was it like studying under Hoppe?
Well, I never studied under him. I mean, I was already a practicing lawyer. I was just colleagues with him. I've been with him dozens of times because I would see him. We became really good friends. So I've just had tons of conversations with Hans. I'd say I've learned from Hans more from reading his works, actually, more than, when we meet together. One time in 2018, the Mises Institute had its 35th anniversary celebration in New York City. And my wife came with me because she likes New York. And I've been in this movement for a long time, like 20 years or maybe. And all my friends had never met my wife because she never attends these events with me. She's got a busy career. Some of them is one of these things where people say, "Are you sure you have a wife?" Because they never meet him. But she finally came with me to the New York thing. And so I had dinner. I arranged a dinner with Hans, Hoppe, and Guido Holzmann, who's one of my best friends, and their wives. So all six of us went to a nice restaurant, and we finally got to have dinner. And they got to see I have a wife, and she got to meet these guys she's heard me talking about for 20 years. And after dinner, my wife says, "I had a good time, but I was waiting for you guys to go at it." And I said, "What do you mean?" Like, we just talked normal stuff, about, we talked cultural stuff and normal conversation. We didn't have a debate about praxeology at dinner. She was expecting something like that. I said, Cindy, when I get together with my good friends, we pretty much all agree on everything. We don't have debates with each other.
How are the Mets,
and especially when the women are, when the wives are around, it was kind of funny. She said, I thought you guys were to go at it, but no. So my point is, I learned from Hans from reading his books and listening to his speeches. I mean, in 2006, he was semi-retired or retired at the time, and was moving out of the U.S., out of Las Vegas, back to Europe, and had remarried or was about to remarry a Turkish woman who's an Austrian libertarian as well.
I heard about Mrs. Hoppe, number 2. I've heard about her.
Yeah, Gulchin, and he formed a new group called the Property and Freedom Society in Turkey in 2006, and I've been going to those meetings annually ever since. And I give a speech, he gives a speech, other people talk, and so I've just been influenced heavily by Hans. Is probably the single greatest influence on my thinking. Partly because he is the synthesis and further advancement of the ideas of Rothbard and Mises, who I say are probably 2 of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. So those 3 to me are the ones that are the biggest. And they're the biggest because they're the most correct, I think, and they have the best social theories.
Yeah, I can't disagree there.
How would you say Hoppe differs from other libertarian thinkers?
Well, first of all, he's an extreme a priorist or an extreme Misesian. So some libertarians are not Austrians; they're just free market types, and some Austrians are not Misesians; they're like Hayekians or George Mason University types. So, number one, he's a hardcore Misesian, which means he uses a lot of praxeology and Misesian type reasoning in his political and property and social theory. He's more Kantian than, say, than Rothbard was. Rothbard was more neo-Aristotelian, kind of Randian influenced. But he's more neo-Kantian like Mises was.
That's what I'm about to say, Mises. I was about to say that.
His defense of rights is his argumentation ethics, which is sort of a transcendental neo-natural rights argument rather than the traditional Aristotelian type natural law argument. And finally, as a non-American, and he kind of came into it with a more radical view of history and of democracy. So I'd say that distinguishes him too. He basically doesn't accept this old-fashioned sort of reverence a lot of old school libertarians have for the founding fathers and the American Constitution and monarchy, like
Rothbard in A New Liberty.
Well, Rothbard was an anarchist at least, but as Hoppe writes in the introduction to his democracy book, even Mises and Rothbard had what he calls a soft spot for democracy. They weren't Democrats. They knew the flaws of democracy, or some of the flaws, but they sort of bought into this Whig theory of history idea that there was a progression and an improvement in human society, in human society, with the collapse of the monarchies of the old world after World War I. And Hoppe has a more revisionist take on that, which I tend to agree with. The move from monarchy to democracy was not an unalloyed progress. It was regression in many ways, and I agree with him on that.
Oh yeah, I especially pointed out, like, I used to do debates on Discords and stuff when some people would be pro-democracy. I'm like, explain to me how the death of monarchs and republics, how the war tactics got dirtier and more generalized and less and took longer to get to do. Explain that to me. Explain that correlation. Good freaking luck. And they'd be like, I know. So they just have one of those slow moments. They didn't have a response. I'm like, sounds pretty fishy to me. No, why does no one talk about this? Or why non-combatants get hurt too, more so in that correlation? Like, because I think it was in Democracy, and I think it was another book where he talks about this a bit.
Yeah, well, there's a guy named R.J. Rummel that a lot of libertarians used to cite as, and he's good on what he calls democide, showing how I think it's called democide, just showing all the carnage and the millions of deaths caused by governments in the 20th century. But he also has this kind of theory that democracies don't usually go to war against each other, and so I don't think the radical anti-democracy Hoppians would really agree with that analysis. It's, you kind of have you have to fudge the data to sort of have that perspective. Democracies, I mean, democracies can get away with more taxation and more war in some ways because they're richer and because people are deluded into thinking they're part of the state. They have
they're psyoped into it. Man, Gregory Bateson, just when you say that, Gregory Bateson's double-blind theory of psychosis, schizophrenia, insanity just plays in the back of my mind. And if what I learned from Don LePleux about Fabian's permeation theory just played in the back of my head just now.
Yeah, if you know there's a monarch or a king that's taking money from you to give you something in return, if he goes too far, you know that you're being expropriated, right? And there's a
yeah. You think they don't have nearly as much of that psyop, double bind, manipulative tactics to cover their asses with?
No. They know that they know the distinction between the rulers and the ruled, and there's a limit to how much the rulers can get away with.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, in the limit, you can chop the head off the state. You can kill the ruler if you have to. So he knows this threat. So he stays within certain bounds. I mean, the U.S. said, "Oh, we revolted from England because taxation without representation. King George is 6,000 miles away taxing us." It's like, yeah, but how? I don't know what the taxes were. They must have been in the low single digits compared to what Washington D.C. does to us, which is 3,000 miles away from most people.
Daily.
And it gets away with far more than 50%.
That wasn't shit compared to what they do to us on a fucking daily. What are you talking about? Shut your LARPing.
And we put up with it because we're told that, well, you have a say so in your rulers because you can vote every 2 years. So we go, okay, I guess.
Sorry.
I guess 65% taxes are not expropriatory because I'm doing it to myself because I have the right to vote after all. I mean, so democracies can get away with more.
But that's comical. It's just bad comedy when I've heard so many fuckers tell me this. I'm like, really? You sure about that, Bob? You sure about that?
I've heard Hoppe, I've heard some critiques of Hoppe, and some categorize him as, since he was inspired very much by Immanuel Kant, some people categorize him as idealist. Would you categorize him as that? Or
to be honest, I've never heard that. I've heard lots of other unfair charges leveled against Hans, but I've never heard him anyone accused of being an idealist, and I don't think he actually is that heavily influenced by Kant. I think he takes some Kantian paradigms, but his reading of Kant, like Mises, is realistic. Hans is a realist, not an idealist. If you read his economic science and the Austrian method, his little monograph, which is on his website too.
Yeah, that's what I figured too. When he come off as realist when I read that, because I got a digital scan of it too.
He's definitely a realist. He blends the realist interpretation of Kant, which is more prevalent on the continent, as opposed to the idealistic interpretation in America. He blends that realistic interpretation, or the core of Kant, with Mises's praxeology to come up with like what he thinks is a new way of justifying epistemological realism, which I think is another path-breaking development by Hoppe. By the way, anyone who's interested in Hoppe, we're talking about him a lot. One way to explore some of this, I'd recommend his most recent sort of compilation, The Great Fiction, which Jeff Tucker put together when he was at Laissez-Faire Books, in which I think a second edition with an expanded second edition has just come out or is about to come out from the Mises Institute. But really, a good place to look would be the Festschrift that I and Guido Holzmann put together for him in 2009 for his 60th birthday. And that's online for free on his website. It's called Property, Freedom, and Society, Essays in Honor of Hans-Hermann Hoppe. So it got a good introduction by me and Guido, explaining a lot of his core insights and lots of essays in different fields by his admirers and colleagues around the world. Drawing on his thought and expanding upon his thought and giving tribute to his contributions. So that's a good place to look for Hans's contribution.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions on my own. Just since, first off, I'm not trying to throw shade and, but certain individuals, so I'm not listing names, but I've heard the claim that, Hoppe was a Marxist, and that was, they quote unquote substantiated that off of, right.
I've never heard that. I've never heard that claim either, to be honest. I mean, he
be glad, because I've had it happen to me 3 times, and I've debated a couple times.
Well, I mean,
but yeah.
He wrote an excellent article called Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis, where he says that the central claims of Marx's class analysis are correct, except he gets his exploitation theory wrong. So his labor theory of value and the exploitation theory linked around that is wrong. But if you replace that with aggression, the libertarian concept of aggression, and you replace the what are the class?
The capitalism, private property thing with the state.
If you replace the bourgeois or the capitalists and the workers with the state and the tax classes, then that's a better analysis of things. But the overall structure has some good insights. It's just his economics is wrong. But that doesn't mean he's a Marxist.
But yeah, no, I've heard that, and I've also heard that on. I've heard that a couple times, and I'm like, where? So the genetic, I thought just because person, 3 was, so just because person 3 was inspired by the co-theorized idea, subject of person 1 and 2, and used that framework and combine it with praxeology to expand it to a whole new thing, does not make it him. What it does not make, do you mean he believes what persons 1 and 2 believe, for Christ's sakes? It's a genetic fallacy.
I mean, Hans explicitly is the world's greatest critic of communism. He hated communism. He hated what East German communism, what it did to his family and to his country. His book of Theory of Socialism and Capitalism explicitly says socialism is horrible and evil. It's not just the centralized control of the means or resources. It's the institutionalized aggression against private property. Therefore, socialism is basically institutionalized criminality, and all states are socialist to the extent they're a state. All violence is socialist to the extent it's institutionalized. So socialism in his mind is explicitly correlated and identified with criminality. And capitalism is identified with the just, good private property order. So Marx was a socialist, right? A communist. Hans is anti-communist. So I don't know how anyone can maintain that. No matter how much they hate him, he's not a Marxist.
In a discussion, I can't remember where the discussion was, but there was a claim. I believe I was talking about. I think it was contract law, and I was basically on the side trying to basically say, well, basically it was more like a not a defense of Hoppe, but it was just trying to kind of illustrate how contract law could work with covenant communities. But then I think the retort to that was that then Hoppe would be a legal positivist, and that would and I read more into Hoppe, and I read some of I believe it was economic science and the Austrian method, and there are just pages there. If you even look for the word positivist, Hoppe is highly critical of logical positivism.
He just drone cobalt bombs it basically.
Yeah, Hoppe is the critic of Marxism and the critic of logical positivism. I mean,
it was, I don't know if their interpretation was wrong of it. I have no idea. I've tried to talk about that more, but it's just something that's kind of stuck with me sometimes with critiques of Hoppe, is that these particular critiques, they seem to level things against Hoppe when you press on, there really is nothing to substantiate the claim. That's one thing I just was sticking in my mind.
Most of Hoppe's opponents, they're opponents for various reasons. Number one, he's German, and these guys think you're a Nazi if you're German, I guess. Number two, he's very popular. They don't like that. It's just competition. Number three, he was Rothbard's sort of right-hand man. They didn't like that. And there was always this hostility between the respectable DC Beltway Cato types and the Mises Institute, and they continually malign and slander and dishonestly characterize the views of the Mises Institute because they're more radical and they're more principled than these guys, and we're willing to condemn things. We're willing to stand up for the right to discriminate, which is a right. We're willing to call the federal government completely evil. The American Revolution was a unconstitutional and unjust coup. The Constitution was not a good thing, it was centralizing, right? We're just too radical and principled for these guys, and it's just a smear campaign. They should stay in their lanes and know their betters, I believe.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah. It seems that it's kind of like the particular critiques I've been coming from is kind of it's not the Cato types. It's a very radical kind of I don't know how they got this interpretation of Rothbard, in my opinion, but it kind of seems like a very are you familiar with like C4SS?
Yeah, I used to be on their board of advisors. I resigned about 5 years ago when Kevin Carson kept posting about how we should behead C-suite executives in corporate America, and saying that anyone who makes more than $250,000 a year is a thief, because it's basically impossible. It's impossible in a free market to make. It's impossible to make.
I have friends that used to have make duplicate accounts to go on Twitter just to piss him off for shit that.
Well, Kevin is good. He's very smart. He's good on something. He's good on intellectual property, actually. I don't agree with all of his mutualism. Some of it has some good insights. But Roderick Long is a good friend of mine. He's a left libertarian. I did remain on as an advisor to the Molinari Review, which is a sort of a side project affiliated with that. But I didn't want to be affiliated with C4SS because it's just too leftist for me and too mutualist. And this, if you're joking, saying that beheading of corporate executives is justified, it's just too much hostility to capitalism for me. I am a capitalist, and I think. We're adult enough to distinguish between crony capitalism and the pure private law society, which would be capitalist in my view.
Yeah, so it's kind of like in that I just found that kind of like that realm of critique very interesting, because the areas the people engage in that type of critique, they're very influenced by Rothbard, they're very influenced by other types of thinkers like Kevin Carson, but it kind of goes into a direction where it's just very peculiar, like some of the claims, and I don't know, it was very interesting to me.
The other thing, other thing I wanted to ask was, since you mentioned that it was a transcendental formulation, don't discourse ethics and argumentation ethics also deal in meta ethics? Basically, aren't they meta ethical to an extent?
I think so. Although that point
that's what I thought
is not really explicitly made by Hans, I think, in every case, but I think it's implicit, and I do agree with Douglas Rasmussen and Dan Oyle's approach to individual rights, libertarian rights, as being meta norms, which is rights. When we talk about what rights are, and we justify them with some normative argument, we're not coming up with guides for human behavior. Like, we're not talking about morals, which is what morals are, guides for personal, like telling you what's immoral and moral to do in your own life. I think that the purpose of rights is a guide to what law can be justly enforced, what law should be put into place. And I think that's a better way of looking at it. A simplistic approach would be to say that libertarian rights are a subset of morality, so that like not everything that's immoral can be made illegal, but everything that's illegal is immoral. And that used to be my view like 30, 25 years ago. But I've rejected that. I don't think that rights, properly speaking, are a subset of morality. I think they're an intersecting set. I think that most things that are rights violations are immoral, but not necessarily so. So, for example, if we say there's a right to private property, that would imply many things. It would imply, for example, that you can own a home and you would have the right to use force to repel someone trying to use it without your permission or your consent. But it doesn't mean that you're moral in doing so in every case. So let's say I need to break into your house to save my child in a snowstorm or something, and your cabin in the woods and no one's there. Technically speaking, that's a violation of my property rights and a violation of the law. But is it immoral for me as a father to do that? Maybe, maybe not. I think probably not. But the point is that the normative reasoning that tells us the law would be justified, that can be used to prosecute me for doing that, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a moral law telling me it's wrong to do it. Like, it might be moral for me to do it and to be willing to pay the price after, something like that. So but I think in most cases, when you commit aggression as defined by libertarian law, in most cases it is immoral, in my opinion. But that's the province of moral theory, not libertarian theory. So I'm opposed to the stickism stuff. I think that libertarianism is a very narrow doctrine about what laws are justified.
Yeah, I was curious about that because, I just wondered.
And I think that's compatible with the nature of Hans's argumentation ethics. Like, he's really talking about when people get together, they're having a discourse about what laws outside the argument would be justified.
Yeah, and they're presupposing certain conditions in order to establish that you're having to work on when you argue. That's the essence of argumentation ethics. Yeah, to identify that that's the case. One thing I did want to ask though is if Professor Hoppe was if he was okay with, say a fan wanted to email him and tell him, like, thanks for what you've done and so on and so forth, would he be okay with that?
Absolutely. He doesn't always respond, but he's totally okay with it. He doesn't always respond, but he would appreciate. I know he would appreciate it. He appreciates people who express their appreciation.
Yeah, that's fine. Because I'm not gonna lie, because the reason his shit clicked in me like that when I was discovered was because I'm like, damn, I've been living this physical removal and this type of what he's explaining here that's been my life. Because the reason I mentioned Konkin and Roth was because I'm not gonna lie, for 7 years my dad and I ran, I guess you'd say, an agoristic, lenient business, right? We used to repair people's equipment, and then we started when he was still in a damn wheelchair because he had a boulder fall on him, as I mentioned before, and it foobarred. But none of this was heart, but his leg was permanently screwed up. He had to have foot surgery after foot surgery. Got all the hospital, all the trips to the hospitals. Oh, but we worked on people's equipment, mostly yard equipment, sometimes garden farming equipment, small and medium scale. Sometimes he did people's, injectors, spark plugs, oil change, things like that, or did something when people needed it and couldn't go right to a mechanic right then or something. So minus some of the stuff that Konkin exchanged back and forth with Rothbard that kind of clued at possibility of being lenient to theft. I didn't agree with that at all. Some of that stuff clicked. And then when I read Hoppe, I'm like, this just clicks. It just clicked. And I'm like, I lived by this. Like, if someone crossed me, like someone stole my tools or someone tried to cheat me, you're gone. be gone, bitch, and stuff like that. So this is what physical removal entails. I'm like, this is what saved me from ever getting into a violent conflict. This thing and living like how he explained. This actually saved my ass from actual, kinetic conflict in person. It has, and I just wanted to genuinely tell him that because, and then I just wish my dad was alive to see this. And
so, do you have any stuff in the works now?
I'm hoping. My goal is this year, say in the next 6 months, to finally finish an edited selection of my libertarian legal theory articles, which will be called Law in a Libertarian World. So that's my main project this year. Tomorrow, I don't know when you're going to release this, but tomorrow, Saturday, the 8th of January, I'm participating in an Austrian economics Discord server virtual conference with some other scholars from the Mises Institute, like Peter Klein and other guys like that. So I'm doing that tomorrow. I don't know when this will come out, but yeah. And this year I traveled a lot last year for libertarian related events, Porkfest and Turkey and Florida and New York and others. This year I'm gonna slow down because it's just been a lot. So I'm gonna do a lot of things virtually. So interviews, conferences, things online. I'm gonna do things online this year.
Well, it was nice having you on the show.
Sounds good, guys. I appreciate the intelligent questions and your show.
too,
Keep
sir.
it up.
Thank you very much for coming on the show. This has been episode 3 of the Radio Ancapistan podcast, signing off.